Welcome to a presentation by the Australian Delphi Users Group that was shown at our recent 2022 Symposium. Before we start the actual presentation, I would like to go through a few things. Our forums provide a resource where you can ask questions and receive answers about Delphi. There are many experienced Delphi users who watch our forum and provide helpful answers to your questions. You can also show your knowledge by answering questions that others may have. Attendees of the symposium have access to a 2022 symposium category, which is where you will find information related to this year's symposium. This will include the videos, links, and content provided by the presenters. ADUG has regular local meetings in Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, and Adelaide. Many of these meetings can be watched online via Zoom. Watch the meetings category in the forums for announcements of upcoming meetings, information you need to know to go to them, and what topics are going to be discussed at the meeting. I would like to encourage everyone who is able to attend our meetings to learn and network and meet up with other developers like you. We're always looking for people to present topics, and I'm sure there are many people watching who have unique expertise that others would be interested in knowing about. This year's presenters are Malcolm Groves, Ray Konopka, Alistair Christie, and Stefan Glenke. We would like to thank our sponsors for supporting this year's symposium. This year, our major sponsor is CodePartners, whom many already know as distributors of Delphi and RAD Studio. You will also know Malcolm Groves, who has been actively involved with ADUG for over 20 years. In recent times, CodePartners have taken over and redeveloped Smart Inspect, an advanced .NET logging, Java logging, and Delphi logging tool for debugging and monitoring software applications. CodePartners offer a range of products and services as well as Delphi and RAD Studio. A blog, Code Insight TV, and other resources are available from their website. In addition to sponsoring our symposium, CodePartners is providing 2 Smart Inspect licenses for our prize draw. We thank CodePartners for their ongoing support. We would also like to thank our prize donors who have provided us with excellent providers for attendees to win. Now, without further ado, here is one of our symposium presentations.
This is a topic that has been talked about for quite a while, but it's one where we're still working through the details and finding gaps and things of how do we really want to support high DPI in our applications. And specifically, I'm going to be focusing today on the VCL. So traditional Delphi applications built with the VCL framework targeting Windows, whether it's 32-bit, 64-bit, and so forth. But there's a lot of things, and there's a lot of historical baggage that we kind of need to be aware of in order to fully understand why we have the solutions we have today and what are still some of the gaps and things we have to be concerned with as we move forward in supporting a high DPI display. So here's a quick agenda. We'll come back to that as we fill out these topics. So the first notion that we want to understand is when we say DPI, what is it that we're really referring to? And it's dots per inch, and most everyone is familiar with that. We're quite familiar with it from the printing world. If you think about it, we are familiar with, a laserjet printer should have at least 300 DPI. That gives us a decent quality. A good laser printer is going to have 600 or 1200 dots per inch. And it's great because at that point you get extremely smooth curvatures. There's no anti-aliasing or pixelating effects. Well, the same is true for our monitors. It's a raster display. When you get down to it, what are we dealing with? But we deal with the pixels instead of true dots. And historically, those pixels, those dots per inch have been 96, going all the way back to VGA, VGA, XVGA, SVGA, and so forth. The pixel size essentially remained constant for a couple decades. And a lot of people will confuse DPI with resolution. And historically, we've seen greater resolutions come, but higher DPIs or DPIs really haven't changed. And we can see that by looking at some screen resolutions and comparing the dots per inch or pixels per inch that they have. So a very common standard old classic, XVGA monitor would be 96 DPI, a standard 11 inch, maybe 12 inch. You go to a laptop screen, 1440 by 900, you're still talking 96 DPI. That is what Windows was designed for. We've been coding to that standard since the beginning. As we get newer monitors, they've gotten bigger. And depending on what manufacturer, you might technically get a slightly different DPI value, like the Apple Thunderbolt display, 2560, 1440, 109 DPI to be technical, but it's close enough to 96 to where you really don't notice any difference. But if you have any newer MacBook or a Surface tablet with the Retina display or a high DPI display, you're upwards of 200 dots per inch now, almost double or more what our traditional size is. So the physicality of the pixel rendering on the screen has changed. And that is the core concept that we really need to understand when it comes to talking about high DPI. And what I'm currently running on is my new Apple Studio display, which is running at 218 DPI as a 27-inch monitor. And so it's great if your system like Mac OS really has intrinsic support for high DPI. Windows is better, still has some gaps. So now that we understand that the pixels themselves have changed size, what does that mean for our programs? Well, two things. One is we need to be concerned with what's called a display scale factor. And the reason for that is historically, we would deal with a desktop computer. If you think back when Delphi 1 through Delphi 7 was around, it was desktop displays, 1024 by 768. It may be a little bit physically bigger, but it was still the same number of pixels left and right, and everything was set. The scale factor was 1. We never did anything. If you zoomed in, you were zooming in manually. It wasn't affecting the text representation. It wasn't affecting the size of your toolbar buttons and things like that. However, with a varying number of displays, different tablets and Windows specific, but desktops and external monitors and so forth, the display scale factor is how we can translate our representation of what we think the size needs to be to what is actually rendered on the screen. To complicate it, the DPI that our Windows system can support is also dynamic, meaning that it changes. And it can, the most common way that it changes is simply from having multiple monitors. So if you have a laptop and an external monitor and they're both up and running, you'll have 2 different DPIs running on it. That's actually how I'm going to be showing the differences. It's nearly impossible to try to do that live. So I've done screen captures with both side-by-side resolutions, as we'll see when I show the demos. And we'll see one with my Retina display MacBook running Windows VM, and then an external monitor, which is actually physically bigger, but it actually has a smaller DPI. And we'll see what the changes are between them. But whether you dock an app and have an external monitor, your remote desktop connections will render different DPIs. And not to mention the user settings, when you go in and change the scale factor that's part of Windows, starting with 10 and up and 11, that the user may change and say, hey, I want the scale factor to be 250% or 300% of what's considered standard. And so we need to consider all of those. So to start, let's talk about the multiple monitors. And this is what I was just alluding to, of having two different displays. It's my Windows desktop. The split screen here is the left side is representing my native resolution on my MacBook Pro running Windows VM, and connected to it, shared, this is my external monitor running at 96 DPI. It's 100% scaling. I'm 250% scaling on the left so that it zooms up. And you can see that it's the same window. And what happens if I move and drag the one window over to the other desktop, the minute more than 50% of my window is on the other desktop, the size and gets rendered in that new DPI. And so you'll see that now, okay, my mouse is still big because I'm on this side, but as I move that over, the menu sizes, the window size is the same. And now I've clicked over, and yes, it still says 256 DPI scaling, but that's only because I'm now on this other side here. So some other things to note, I am extremely particular when it comes to the fidelity of the rendering when we're talking about our different displays. We spend so much time designing our interfaces and our menu structures and the layout and so forth. And then a lot of developers really struggle when they go to high DPI because things don't quite look right, and it's not obvious why. And part of what my focal point of this session is to talk a lot about those things. What are the gotchas? What are the things to watch out for when you're developing your own applications to get a better understanding of what I need to be aware of? So one of the things I like to point out is this is standard 96 DPI, the standard font that comes with Windows. The menu representation just looks like what we expect it to. But if we look at this other size, and at 250% DPI scaling, I would expect the physical size, if I measured this with a ruler and I measured this with a ruler, that this length should be 2.5 times longer than the 100% scaled one. I would also expect the spacings between the menu items, both the horizontal spacing and the vertical spacing, to be the same, and they're not. And this is one of the first problems that we run into, is that fonts are displayed with points and not pixels per inch or in pixel size. And a point itself, if you double the point or 2.5 times a point value, that doesn't necessarily translate to a physical pixel translation of 2.5% or 2.5 times. And that's one of the things that makes Windows High DPI look really nice with the crisp text, but it also crams certain things. And so if we look at, say, the window menu, same menu from the previous screen, but everything is crammed together because this particular font was designed with the hinting and the line spacing to not really handle scaling uniformly across all dimensions. So one of the things, so that's one of the things we work on. So some additional concepts of why high DPI is so challenging on Windows. One is that there's no common non-device independent measurement that we can use that applies across the board. There is the concept of a dialogue unit. If you are an old time, if you've been developing Windows or even go predate Delphi and did any like custom Windows development, writing your own message queue and hook and doing all that extra work and creating, the old system resources for what we would call dialogues, but that's not even constant. It's based on other values, and they can be different horizontally versus vertically, which all makes it more challenging. So what ended up happening is over time, we as an industry has landed on using the pixel as our unit of measure for laying out forms and so forth. Delphi's done it, VB's done it, WinForms has done it, everybody's done it. And we've worked out ways to try to get around doing it now as we're trying to handle things like high DPI, non 100% scale factors and so forth. And this is a challenge if you've done any experience with desktop publishing or Mac OS, which does a lot of graphics work, and it's based off of the concept of 72 points per inch. And so its PPI value doesn't stand for pixels per inch, it stands for points per inch. And so whether you're doing an iOS app or a Mac OS app, the units of measure are all done in points per inch, and they handle scaling that across the board. So it's very challenging when you're trying to compare one way of doing it to another. So let's drill some more into how does Windows support DPI scaling and what can we do with it? And so let's take a closer look. And fortunately, Delphi has done a lot over the last few releases to really add better support for it. So just trailing Microsoft's, when they're adding a new feature, Delphi's right there to provide the same capabilities that we can do. And all of it centers around your application manifest. And I'll show this in code just a little bit. I want to give everybody the context of what's Microsoft done and then what we can do and how do we want to leverage it. Because you technically have choices, but it really boils down to 3 at the end of the day. And we'll come to explaining all of that shortly. So there's multiple ways. There's a DPI awareness setting in Delphi. So let me pull up the IDE, and I have a test application, and we're going to be showing this in a variety of different ways shortly. But if I go into my project options and we pull up our options, go to the manifest section, you'll see that there's a DPI awareness. Now I'm running Delphi 11, hopefully everybody is. These same things apply to Delphi 10.4. In 10.3, there's some level, but it really started with 10.3 and then 10.4 became more complete and then more enhancements with 11. But this DPI awareness, you have these various settings. And so I'm going to go through what each one of these do and how it impacts our application. So let me switch back to this. So if you're unaware, then what this really means is that you're telling Windows that you don't care what DPI value is set that's currently running. I want you to render the app thinking that it is a 96 DPI application, but stretch the image so that it matches the DPI that's currently being used by the Windows desktop that I'm on. So if I run my 400 by 300 pixel window at 96, but I'm running on a 200% scaled display factor, then the real size that image shows up or that form shows up on the screen is going to be twice as big. It'll be 800 by 600. And so, but the app still thinks that it's 400 by 300. It just looks bigger. Nothing we need to do with that. There's consequences to that, and we'll see when we go through examples of all of these. The next variation is called system aware. And this is kind of interesting because this tells the app to assume the DPI of whatever the default or primary monitor is for when the user logs in. And if you move the window around, Windows will stretch or compress the form to fit on whatever the DPI is of that new form. But it's a little odd because it all depends on what the primary monitor is. You're never going to use this one. Per monitor was Microsoft's first real start back in Windows 8 to think about, oh, I've got different display factors, scaling factors, and DPIs for each of my desktops, if you will, my monitors that I have. And so it will notify the application, oh, you've changed DPI. Go ahead and do something. And it's okay, but there's some gaps, as we'll see quickly. That was replaced when we Windows 10 Creators Update introduced two new, more improved ways of handling DPI awareness. First is GDI scaling. And this was quite interesting because it tells Windows, this setting tells Windows that your app is going to run in its normal 96 DPI value. You're not going to think that the form is any bigger. It's just going to stretch it out. However, any text that gets displayed in your app, because it's rendered by the GDI and it's doing the font, that's what's handling the display. Behind the scenes, the scaling factor that's used for the DPI that form is running under, it will update the font size to match. So what you get is really nice, crisp fonts when you're running on a higher DPI scale factor display. However, it does nothing when it comes to graphics and so forth. So it's kind of neat, kind of a good stopgap, but again, there's issues. The most complete option you have is called Per Monitor version 2, introduced also in Windows 10. It gives us the notification that the DPI changes from Windows to window. And then, but it also takes care of it's automatically scaling some, the non-client area, any themes that, VCL styles and things that are used in your controls and, OS dialog boxes pick up this. Now, there's still things that we need to do. And so that's what I want to show next is, okay, what do we see if we pick each one of these? And then where does that let us go? So here's my test app. I've got no awareness at all. What this does, the add button creates a dynamic button and it's set to a certain size. So everything works as expected. So I click the button, that button gets created with a specific, width and height, positioned inside of the container panel. And then there's other buttons, like on the toolbar button, it tells you what the form dimensions are. We can remove it. But if I drag that over, so I'm just moving it to the new desktop, because it's running at a 250% display scale factor, the image that Windows itself presents that form at a stretched method. So what we can see is, yes, it's physically bigger, and certain things kind of start, like the title bar and things get stretched. But notice how the text inside is starting to look fuzzy. And if you look at the C, where there's curvatures, you can see anti-aliasing coming into play. That's because this is simply a stretched version of a 96 DPI image rendered onto a higher display. So you lose a lot of it, and the images look terrible. Fonts, it's passable, it works, but it's really not taking advantage of that. And you can see here the real dimensions of this form. It still thinks it's 425 by 405. So let's take a system-aware version. System-aware version is kind of interesting. I've moved it over onto my external display, and you can see that the images are really small. That's because this is the one that picks up my logged-in primary display, which is my high-resolution one. And so when I've moved it over, it's actually made things smaller. And so you can see that the size is 1,000 by 1,000, but it's been stretched smaller to fit the 100% scaling. Again, not really what I want. If I bring this over, now you can see that, oh, these images are these 16 by 16 pixel images. That's what it looks like on this higher res display. And this is really what comes down to when we start talking about supporting high DPI and using a pixel as a unit of measure, because the physical pixel size differs. And if I look at my 100% display, a 16 by 16 pixel image is almost 1/4 of an inch. But when I run it on a 200 plus DPI display, that 16 by 16 image is less than 1/8 of an inch. So we can't just show the same size, they become too small. Now, the nice thing with when you have lots of dots there, notice how the the C's and the fonts look better because it's actually rendering at a much higher font size to display that. So per monitor tries to do the same thing a little bit better, gives you the ability to pick up when I move things over. So as I move it over to this, it's re-rendering, but here's one. So I never use this one because when you move it, it doesn't update all of the client controls. The title bar in the non-client area gets it, but this is still rendering the wide scroll bar from the old original size. So again, you're never going to want to use that one. GDI scaling is kind of interesting because it's a hybrid of the per monitor and the unaware one. So standard 400 by 400, everything looks great. I move it over. One of the things to note is that the fonts actually look pretty good. There's no anti-aliasing. It's looking crisp. The edit boxes and things look okay. Now my tool images do not. And we're going to talk about how to fix that as we move forward. But right now that's a gap because these look pretty lousy. But the rest of it's not too bad. And then per version 2 is the kind of the best or most complete solution from what Microsoft gives us. Still has some gaps that we're going to fill in as we move forward. So looking in here, we have our menu structure. We're going to move that over. And again, here, everything is looking good. We've got higher res fonts that are shown in. These are actually scaled in the application. It's not hidden by the GDI. And all of the text looks good. My images aren't right because they're still rendering as 16 by 16 images on a much larger display. So I really need to use larger images when I'm running on a higher DPI monitor. And we'll see how we support that in a little bit. And then one thing finally, so I'm kind of going back. I was just making sure the size, let me go back to this. The physical size of this, when I've dragged this over onto the high DPI, physically changes. So we need to be aware of, hey, what pixels per inch am I currently running? That might come into play because when I do things like dynamically create a button, that is dependent on the current pixels per inch I'm running in my app. And so if I move this back over to my high DPI monitor and go and click the add button, well, this was created at what 96 DPI values would be good for, not whatever my pixels per inch are right now. And so these are the things that we're going to fix or figure out how to fix as we move forward. And the first thing I want to talk about is the images, because this is one of the biggest issues that people have is, you built all this stuff, or you've created toolbars, you go and monitor, you run it on a high DPI display and the images look really tiny, or they get stretched and they look extremely pixelated. So let me drive into this concept of an image collection. And this is a new component from Delphi 10.3 on forward, so you have it, but it represents a shared repository of images with different resolutions. You can think of it in terms of if you've ever built a custom icon, and an icon itself has different image representations for the different sizes, 16 by 16, 24, 32, and so on. And we can do that for each of our images that our application wants to support or use. The interesting thing about it is it has no concept of how it's going to be used or where. It's simply a collection. So with that in mind, you can put it on a shared data module or some other place in which we have access to it across all of our forms. One of the things that I'll recommend, I'll show about how to load up the files and manage it, because when you have a lot of images at different resolutions, you really want to have ways of managing that. So embedding the size into the name of the file is very helpful because the image collection editor will support loading that for you quite easily. So taking the next step is we have this collection, but that just has all of the images that we want to support in varying resolutions. But when it comes to an actual form that needs to use an image list, instead of the standard image list component, which is specifically set at design time, what size it represents, typically 16 by 16 or 32 by 32, we create a virtual one, which gets its images from an associated image collection and then uses whatever DPI value is currently set for the form that that image list is on to pick out the most appropriate sized source image and use that in the image list. And it's quite sophisticated in what it can support. A thing to note is that unlike the collection, which you can put into a data module and you can share it across all the applications, you don't want to do that with a virtual image list. Wherever you want to use a virtual image list, or whatever form, you want a virtual image list on that form. And the reason for that is if we drag the form to a different monitor, it may be running at a different DPI, so it needs to use a different set of images from the collection to do its rendering. And if we just have one, then it's wherever's hosting that virtual image list, those are the sizes that it will be served up to whatever controls are dependent on the image list. And then I'll show the autofill property because it's quite handy. So what I want to do now is actually update the test High DPI app that I've been showing with these changes. So let me switch back over to here. And if I go ahead and change them to do the per monitor V2, because that's really the only choice you have. I mean, you can do the GDI one if you really find you wanted better text rendering and you really didn't care, you didn't have a lot of graphics in it. That's actually quite cool. That's kind of the only case where it really makes sense to do the GDI one, where you don't really have to do any other changes in your code because it still thinks it's a 100% 96 DPI app, but it uses better fonts when you're on a higher DPI monitor. So that's kind of cool. If you've got a lot of graphics and things, it's not that great. So I'm going to change that. We'll go ahead and save that piece there. But now, as you can see in this application, I've got an action list because there's menus. We've got toolbar buttons. The main toolbar is tied to an images list. The action list is tied to the image list. The main menu is tied to the image list. And of course, the image list itself is right here, and it has the collection of the images, and it's set up like most of our applications that we built as just a 16 by 16 set of images, standard 96 DPI, pixels per inch of what we're going to use. But that's, as we've seen, that's not going to work for us. So the first thing that we want to do is add in an image collection. So I'll type in image collection. I'm just going to put that in the middle. And then I know I'm also going to need a virtual image list. And I'll drop one of those down on the form as well and move them so I can access them easy enough. When I double click on the image collection, it brings up the image collection editor, which looks rather ominous, like all these buttons and things. And once you kind of drill through it and see how it works, it is pretty straightforward. The first task really is I need to add some images to my collection. And this is where I want to add in images of different sizes. I highly recommend having the size and file name checked. If you set up your images ahead of time, which is what I've done. So if I go to my demo files for my setup here, go to my glyphs, I've got a directory called edit, which has a bunch of images in it, all named with a category that I want to use, the name of the image, and then what size it has. And I have edit and file, which are the two menus that I have inside my app. Let me switch back over to here. I click on add and navigate to my demo files, glyphs, go into edit. I'm going to just simply select all of them and click OK. And because I had the size and the name, it figures out, oh, for the edit copy, I've got 5 different images that are all under that same name and set up. Now, there's some things I wish we did better. Like I would like to be able to set the category before adding the images in, but you can't really do that. So you can select them all and then set a category. So if I wanted to do edit, and the only reason to do that is that if you were looking for a particular image, the category will filter this list. Then we go ahead and add in the file ones. So I'll go back to glyphs, go into file, select all of these, add that in, and I get another set. So file new to there, I'll set the category on this to be file. Click OK, and we have all of our settings. And so we can see them all, and they're all, as you can tell, there's different resolutions. Obviously, these are all stretched to fill this same visual representation, but that's a 16 by 16 image. And we get all the way up to the 64 ones, which work really nicely. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And what we will see is that my image collection now has 11 images in it. Well, that's great. But I need to be able to get those images that I want into an image list to be used by my action list, my main menu, and my toolbar. And to do that, we need to go to our virtual image list. And the first thing we want to do for that is connect it to our collection. And so the collection is set. Now, the other thing that we're going to want to do here is the same thing we do with a regular image list. What is the default size image that we want to load up? Well, I just want a 16 by 16 image. If I'm running at 100% scaled UI, I want a 16 by 16 image. So that's how we're going to set the height and the width for this particular virtual image list. And then I can double click on this image list and go and click and add in from the collection whichever image I want. Now notice I'm just picking the base image, the name. It doesn't care about the resolution of that image yet because it doesn't know. It's going to be dynamic based on where this form with this virtual image list happens to be running. Now, I typically don't add them in manually. Instead, I typically just use the autofill because I say, hey, give me all of the images that are in the collection, make them available in my virtual image list. So the number of images that I have are 11. Now, the real resolution, the real set of images in that image list will change when I move it from one thing to the other. So what do I need? Now that my virtual image list is set, I can go to each of my controls and simply change them to be using the new virtual image list. And now I've set this up so that the order of the old image list is the same as my virtual one. So that's why I loaded them up in the way that I did. So everything syncs up and works correctly. But if they're not, you can do the same thing. So if I go back to my images here, I'll go ahead and load this up. And at this point, the old image list 1 is no longer used, so I can remove that. And everything is going to be using these new images. Well, this is great. So now what happens when I go and run this? So let's switch back over to here. So I've done the screenshot so I can drag from one monitor to the other, but those are the changes that I just made. And I run this and it looks the same because at 96 DPI on 100% scaled desktop, this app looks like a regular, application. There's nothing different. The images, these are 16 by 16 images that are showing up. Everything's great. Well, the key thing is when I move it to my high DPI display, the virtual image list detects the DPI change. And since it goes from 100% to 250%, the virtual image list says, oh, I need a new set of images. Go to the collection and get me, if I wanted a 16 by 16 pixel image and I'm at 250% bigger, a 48 pixel image is probably going to fit that nicely. and that's what it returns, and that's what gets displayed. And so they're much cleaner and nicer out there. So it's a really cool way to bring in the higher DPI images when we're at that that level. And I'm hoping there's lots of questions. Once we finish up, I got one more section, and I'll be able to answer a bunch of questions on all this, because I've been doing this a number of times, and they all same ones come up. The last piece I wanted to show is what happens how do we fix that dynamic nature? I'm running on a high DPI display. My physical form size is larger, so I need to essentially scale the button that I dynamically create appropriately. And so in order to do things like that, we need some help from the system and from the VCL itself. And that's where this new get system metrics for Windows function comes in. And the VCL wraps that when inside of our code, depending on what operating system you're running. So if you're running on Windows 10 or higher, then it will call the get system metrics for DPI. If you're running on an older system which doesn't support that, it just reverts back down to get system metrics. So it's great. What's really nice is that the VCL surfaces that same function in the T-control get system metrics call. This is important for component writers, as well as anything you do dynamically, because the methods inside of your form, the form class ultimately descends from a control. So you do get the same functionality there. T-control wouldn't control form, or custom form and form. So this gives us the ability to figure out what my DPI or what specific metric settings. So if you need to know the width of the scroll bar, running on a high DPI system is quite different than running on a 96 DPI. Current PPI property is your friend. This will give you the value that you need in order to do the appropriate scaling when you want to render something dynamically. So let's take a look at, well, let me go back to Delphi here and show you the code that I need to change. So let me go back to my code, and all the sample code here, this is all going to be provided in a link at the end. And so I'm going to bring this up as a little help, because I'm not going to type it all in right at the moment. But if I go into the add button and take a look, here you can see I'm dynamically creating the button at position 10, 10, it's 75 and 25 width and height. That's why it doesn't look right when I run on a higher DPI. 75 pixels is hardly anything. So in order to fix this, I need to be aware of what the current pixels per inch is for my monitor that I'm running under. And that's where the current PPI value can come into play. So what I do is, let me get rid of all of that. I'll reset. I still have my original values. I still want it in this same relative spot, 10 from the left and top in a 96 DPI system, but we do the multiply divide scaling adjustment using the current DPI. So if I'm running at 250%, or 96, 250, like 248, then that will give me a scaling factor to make that the width, height, and the positioning adjusted. So now when I go and run my application, I've got the right size. I dynamically create it. It's at 96 DPI. It's where it's 75 wide, 25 tall. I now move my form to a higher display and click on it. So like, yes, I'm running at a higher DPI. My physical size of my form has increased. Now, when I click on the button, I'm at 240 DPI. The scaled version of the button now is picked up based on the DPI, the current PPI that I've used for that. So, a couple things to be aware when we're talking about the IDE and changes that have been made in RAD Studio 11, because you probably have seen over the last several months on how the IDE itself has been updated to support high DPI displays. There are situations where you may not want it to run in a high DPI aware mode. One of the reasons for doing that is your form designer surface is rendered at that small size. which can actually be quite hard to work with. You can change it. In the user interface form designer, there's some settings that you can pick, but another option you might want is to run the IDE in high DPI unaware mode. And there's a link that's provided in the program group to do that. You can also put a command line on it. If you have multiple designers that are working on a project and they're all running at different resolutions, you probably want to have a consistent setting to where, oh, I want the form designers to be either low or some standard size, maybe make it 150 so that it's a little bit bigger. And the reason for this is these values and things get stored inside the form files, and the scaled property that's now available in T-form allows the scaling to take place at design time in the form designer. So that gets saved off so that when you load it up, it gets adjusted based on the real DPI that's used for the window that you're on, or the monitor you're on. That was my first bullet item there. So those are some things to consider when dealing with the scaled versions of the IDE. Typically, I tend to develop with the standard, do it at 100%, 96, do the low setting, even if I'm running on a high DPI display, because it gives me more control. So when I'm designing it, I know that it's at that size, and then adjust upwards, because we're never going to go down. We're not going to go from 96 DPI to 48. We're always going to go up. And so it's just a way to manage it better. And so we're 45 minutes through, and that's the last of the slides and things, but I'm happy to answer questions, have more discussions on it. If anybody has any immediate ones, I'll pause from there. If not, I've got some more things I'll chime in.
Right.
But here's where you can download the sample code for that app and see how all of that stuff works.
Ray, I'm not sure if I'm unmuted, but I've got a question. So say you've got a development team, two scenarios. Let's say you've got 4 developers, 3 of them have regular old style low DPI screens. One has a high DPI screen. What do you recommend for the IDE settings then? And then the reverse, when you've got 3 developers with high DPI screens and 1 with the low. So this is one of the things where I'll kind of go against, there was a ton of work that was put in to make the IDE support high DPI, which is great. However, I think it's really only usable where you don't run into problems in scaling issues and scale factor multipliers as you switch from one to the other if you use a common scale factor when designing your forms. The code editor and everything else, the tool windows, the object inspector, that all looks fantastic when you're running at high DPI. So it's a clarity of text, I get it. The code editor, great. I can get nice crisp code and everything looks wonderful. It's the form designing is the biggest challenge, because if I'm developing my app, I think, in my opinion, you have to have everybody using the same display scale factor for your form designer. So while you could argue, okay, everybody runs at high DPI unaware, that's really eliminating this concept of all the beauty that comes in with a nice high IDPI and the great fonts and so forth. So with that in mind, and I ended up running it that way for 10.4 for quite a bit, even though it was available in 10.4 to some level, because there were toolbar problems. Like if you made a change to your toolbar and you ran it in high DPI mode, your IDE toolbar would reset to default. And mine is anything but the default. And so I kind of had to go back into that. But to me, I would run it in the low setting for the form designing. So you're designing your form with 96 DPI, laying everything out the way you would expect it. Then in code or using the virtual image list and so forth, you will adjust appropriately at runtime when your app is running on a high DPI display. Okay.
So if have you got Delphi handy, can you just show the exact setting that you would recommend?
Yeah, let me
We change
back to there. I'm not sure which one I have on this one. So tools, options, let's see. So under high DPI.
Yep.
So VCL Designer, high DPI mode. So as you can see, you can automatic will pick up whatever DPI you're running on your display. And it's the same thing that happens, when I was showing it running, everything looks really small. It's kind of, if you're running at a 300% scaled image or, desktop, you're not going to work at that level small. Yeah. You can adjust things, but the problem is we're so used to the default sizes of controls and things to be based on 96 DPI. It's just easier to lay it out that way and then let it scale when I run it, as opposed to, oh, I'm running at 100% scale or 150% scale factor. So my 16 by 16 image really needs to be 24 by 24. My 30 pixel high toolbar now needs to be 45. And so not all controls are smart enough to pick that up. So you end up doing a lot of hand tweaking. And then when you make a change on your form at that DPI level and you go to save it, what you designed it as, that DPI is stored with the form. So then when your other developer who gets it, who ends up loading it up on their system, which is at 96 DPI, it adjusts the 45 height toolbar down to 30 because it's 96 DPI as opposed to 150% of that.
Yep.
As we all know, when you start making those adjustments back and forth, you can introduce a small rounding error. If they make it 46 and not 45, then it becomes 31. And then, that translates to 47. And then you kind of go back. And those are the things you got to watch for. Now, if you want, if you knew everybody had a set and you wanted it to be a little bit bigger and you were going to say, all of our clients are running at, Windows Surface tablets, they're running at least 200% DPI. So we can set up a user editable value at being, 198, great, or 192, double the 96, then you could certainly do that. But I would recommend the low for designing. I wonder if this will work. So I'm going to close this down. Save changes. Oh, because I'd have to do something like desktop. I don't know if that's going to show up. Let me go and save that. I'll try this real quick. Let me shut this down. And I'll bring that back up in a sec. But if I make this full screen, you guys still see my desktop?
Not at the moment.
Maybe. All right, what I need to do though is here. Let me shut this
sorry.
down.
Yeah, the desktop, yes, but not the dialog that just disappeared.
Yeah, that's fine. I get to. So what I'm gonna run my VM in high DPI mode. And so I don't know how it's going to record and render and all of that stuff, but give me a sec and we'll do a little experiment here. Oh, because I stopped sharing there because I rebooted. That's okay. Back over to here. All right. So now I'm going to run Windows. We'll let this come up. And I'll share my full desktop, which will be quite big, but I think Zoom will scale it down for everybody. It's not going to be pretty because I was doing it 1920 by 1080, and now I'm going to 5,000 by almost 3,000 pixels is what's being rendered. So I know Zoom is going to scale that down. And if I go to my Windows desktop here, let that log in. So my background's stretched out and so forth. And Windows, if I go and pull up my display settings, we will see that I am running at 450% scaling factor with 520, 5120 by 2800. I don't know if you guys can see that, how well.
Yes,
but let me
fine.
fire up Delphi in high DPI mode. Okay, so the image comes up. It's like, oh, great. You know, everything's kind of looking great there. Let me create a new VCL application. And so this is the default size. Now, if you remember, the normal VCL sized form is quite big. You know, and then you can make and change it and so forth. And so the if you go and plop a button down, that's the size that you're seeing. And so it can, again, this is set to where, you know, this is one of those kind of subtle things, is that it's set for the right size. And if I think I can find this in here based on, I haven't made any changes yet, so that's why it's not showing up there. But let me go back to my form. So I know sometimes I find this a challenge to work with when it's that small. Because that's still the 75 by 25 size, that's what it's stored at. So the rest of the IDEs picked up all of that, and the code editor is great. Oh, and you can see that it reset my toolbar. That's still a bug. And my form size here has picked it up. So there's some cool things that you want to do with that. Another side topic, let me go back and get this out. Let me shut this down. Yeah, that's not too surprising. All right, back to there. Let's stop that. We'll share some things. So one of the things that's interesting with, if you add in VCL Styles, because they support high DPI things as well, there's some other challenges that you have to worry about, which comes to like borders of controls and whether they get scaled correctly inside the styles. So you want to make sure you're using high DPI aware VCL Styles. Most of the ones that come with Delphi have been updated, not all of them. You can see it when you look in the style setting. But does anyone have any other questions regarding high DPI and Delphi VCL?
Yeah, you mentioned the menus earlier, and I noticed there was still a bit, the spacing between them was still not good at the end of the demo.
Yes. Nothing you can do about that unless you wanted to owner draw the menu completely yourself, which you might want to do. I am still looking for what I find as an acceptable solution for the spacing that happens with menus, because the problem is this notion that pixel or fonts are driven by a point size, and it is up to the font producer to determine the physical pixels that are used for a given point size and how that gets rendered. And so just because you double the size of your DPI from 96 to 192, for example, that doubling of the point size doesn't translate to a doubling of the pixel size used to render that font. And depending on how the font was designed, the scaling that gets used is not equally proportional, horizontal versus vertical. And that comes into play when you start talking about condensed fonts and so forth. So the heights across them remain the same, but the font is condensed, so the scaling gets adjusted. So That's the real problem. And until Microsoft comes up with a better way to manage the font scaling that happens when you change DPI, there's no automatic way that I'm aware of that will let you make a better spaced out menu unless you owner draw it yourself. And when you handle the measure item on the menu, when you do the owner draw, you would then calculate it using the current PPI value and scale it to the real height you want. And then you would then display the right font that would be there. You would just give it more space in the content area for that menu item. And that's the only solve that I know of right now. But again, that's such a lot of extra effort for, again, it depends on your personality. And if you are really concerned about the spacing and so forth, like I am, I'm tempted to do that in certain things where it's warranted. Like if you have a lot of menus and you want to do things like that, that may have a lot more value. Another thing that I'm actually looking into is the action menu bar. It was one that actually Delphi uses it itself in the IDE. And there's some styling ability in the way it picks up VCL styles, which is better in certain situations than the standard menu that's built into the non-client area. So I've been investigating to see if I can do better rendering of the action menu bar as opposed to the standard menu. But I don't have any findings yet to concretely say, yes, this is the way to go.
Is the standard menu, is that actually drawn by Windows or is that?
Correct.
Yeah.
It's drawn by Windows in the non-client area and it takes care of all of that. So unless you do an owner draw menu, that's why you don't have the level of control that you would normally get.
So really if they're drawing it, they should get it right at that layer.
Absolutely. Microsoft should be doing it right.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, so here's another thing I talked about, how if you've ever run a high DPI Windows, and I know I'm over time, just give me like 2 more minutes and then I can continue on chatting for a while, but Windows will scale checkboxes and radio buttons when you go to a high DPI monitor. It does that by default when you run it. However, Windows uses image slicing for all of your other controls, anything that has a border. And the problem with that is that it doesn't accommodate borders. So when you image slice, you section your image into 9 areas, and the edges simply get repeated out, stretched horizontally or vertically, and the corners are as is, and the client gets stretched out. So that's how you handle a big button of varying sizes. You image slice it, and the curves look great. Well, the raw images that support that are designed for a 96 DPI, which typically uses a 1 pixel border around a list box, for example, or a button. But when you display and you go to a 250% UI, that 1 pixel border, that's how Windows renders it. So everything looks faded or washed out because the border should really be 2 pixels wide to have the same physical representation on a 96 DPI machine. So Windows itself, in my opinion, still has a lot of work to really take advantage of a high DPI display. They're getting better with each release, but it's still frustrating. So with that, I've overstepped my time. I apologize for that, for the remaining speaker, but I will be around in the chat. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to talk about this some more. It's a topic that's really passionate to me these days. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your symposium. Thank you much.
Thanks, Ray.
Very welcome.
Thanks, Ray. That was really good.
Thank you very much.
Continuity groups.
Oh, so if I can, let me answer one of the questions about SVG that came up from a few, just real quick. SVGs are great. And in certain cases, they work really well. Scalable vector graphics, if you have them, it's, when you have a vector-based graphic, it works well. It works well if you have a high DPI. And because most graphic artists, the IDE has the same problem, is they design the images at a high resolution, like a 400 by 400 or 256 by 256 vector size. It's great if you're running at a 300% display that's rendering a 64 by 64 image, then you get the fidelity of it. But if you take that and scale it down to 16 by 16 on a low res monitor, or it's 96 DPI, it looks terrible. And that's one of the things that plagues a number of the icons that are in the Delphi IDE starting with 11, because they've gone the opposite. They've designed them at a high value and then gone lower. What I would like to see the image collection do is that for low res images, I want the fidelity of pixel perfect images. So let me provide a 16 up to 32 or 48. Then after that, let me specify an SVG file for that same image, and then let the system render it in the virtual image list using an SVG to scale it up to higher sizes. So you get the best of both worlds, but we're not there yet, but that's what I'll say on SVGs.
Yeah, Ray, I wasted a huge amount of time converting to SVGs, and then you discover that same issue where if they're not drawn at small sizes, or lines disappear, and you just lose all your definition. And so, I have an application with thousands of images. I got about halfway through before realizing it was the wrong way to go.
So what I have been doing with the next version of CodeSite, I've been in the same case. I want to support high DPI. I want, high fidelity images, both at 96 and on up. Is if you design your icons like I use Illustrator to design my icons, and I actually design them as 16 by 16 pixel images, but using vectors. And so by setting up a pixel perfect image at that size, I know when I generate the image for it, it works great. And then it will scale upwards for there. That's the difference, is if you design it on pixel bounds at that level, it will render really well at low res, and then it'll be equally well at high res. Now, the challenge is a lot of developers and graphic designers think, oh, well, I don't want to do that because I'm losing all this detail. I'm making just a very basic image then. And my argument is you're not, because you're still designing for the same 1/8 of an inch by 1/8 of an inch surface area physically on your screen. So just because you can add more pixels there, like you might have 64 by 64 pixels, that doesn't mean that you have 64 by 64 old pixels. They're small. So the physical size is still 1/8 of an inch. So keeping it as a lower detailed image, but higher fidelity with your anti-aliasing and curvature, it does render really well. But that's not what most of the industry does to build those SVG files.
You mentioned that Windows is getting better and better with newer versions. Are there any improvements in Windows 11 when it comes to menu items that Jared mentioned?
I've been doing some work in the sense of trying things out in Windows 11 to see what's, to be honest, I don't remember if the Windows menu items themselves are better. I think they might be. I do know that the bordering and the image slicing is still the way Windows 11 does its higher support. So some controls that they scale completely, that you have a separate image that's used for the higher resolutions, they look great, but edit boxes and list boxes still look very faint when you run on a 250 to 300, or like in my case, a 450% display. You lose the borders because it's 1 pixel literally, and that is so tiny on that 5,000 pixel wide display. So again, getting better. Hopefully they can move improvements. And now one of the things I'm trying to work with is there's some things that we can do in Delphi to help circumvent some of this. The custom VCL styles use the same essential engine as the Windows style engine does, but it is customizable and different. So there's nothing that prevents Embarcadero from supporting, using borders better when we go to higher DPI displays. That would be huge if we can get that going. So that's my new mission, is to get that, but we'll see.
Thanks.
Do you think there's any prospect that we might get some machine learning cooked up to help us vary icons?
Maybe. That's an interesting thing. I think with some, if you were to do things to where, like I could see Microsoft doing it because they have adopted a very specific style for all of their images. They're essentially outlined. They've gotten rid of fills. There's some rules that they could start and apply to help render some things like that. More wide scale, I'd be less, I don't know if we're quite there yet. It'd be interesting though.
Are there any overheads that people need to be aware of? Have you noticed when you've got more icons on the screen and you're moving it, you're having sort of performance issues or anything like that?
Not that I've noticed. You know, some of the apps I have, you do have a lot of images, and I don't store tons of resolutions. You know, basically you kind of go up, and the image collection will support filling in the gaps. So you don't need to provide every resolution that's there. If you provide a few of them, you'd want at least 3, you know, a 16 by 16, 32 by 32, and then throw a 64 by 64. Anything larger than that, if you had a case, but if you think about it, 16 to 64 is 4 times. So that means you're running at 450% or larger. And my, you know, I have a 450. So that's very little difference when it would come to render it. So if you did those 3, you'd probably be fine in most cases. And that's, you know, yeah, it's 2 more images for every image you have that you're carrying around. But I've not seen it cause an issue because the virtual image list just gives you n number of images. The image collection is what holds the other things, and that's over in memory. So it's not a rendering problem on your display. It's still an image list. It's still drawn by images, and the image list draws it on the designs or the canvas that your toolbar has.
Excellent, thank you.
The problem with GDI object counts with PNG image lists previously, and compared with like a image strip, which is indexed into segments for different images, it put the GDI object count up really, really high. And what happens with the image collection and the virtual image list in that regard?
So that's an excellent question. I've not run into any situations where I've experienced that. But again, I don't think I've really taxed it that much. I mean, my app has like 120 icons in it and so forth. I've not like run into those issues. If you were, well, because I know it's relying on the newer image list support that's built into Windows itself with the 32-bit, you know, images and the transparent masks and so forth. So all of that is there. So I think, yeah, I don't know if that would be an issue. I'd be curious, but I don't have a concrete answer for that one. If I did run into it, you can create multiple image collections if that was something that you would need. So if you had a form that they probably didn't use all of the images in your collection, you could break out the collection or even have your image list only pull a subset of the images. So that would be a way to kind of help circumvent some of that usage.
Thank you.
Anyone interested in some more high DPI IDE tips?
Yeah, we are here to listen.
So if I can, so one of the things I tried to do something a little dynamic when I was doing the session part, and it didn't quite work the way I was expecting. And I just needed to go a little bit further. I was trying to rush it too much. And if you wanted to support high DPI in your IDE, when you went to go to save it, if all of your developers are using high DPI IDE settings, then go ahead and set a constant value. I would not use one that is user-based, that varies. But if you use the low value, then if you're running on a high DPI, the form is too small to interact with, as I was showing. But if you do change it, I recommend changing it to a nice, evenly divisible number. And what I mean by that is I've gone in and changed, I know I'm back to high DPI, so it's going to get scaled down quite a bit. But if you set your custom BPI level to 192, which is twice the size, then you'll be able to work with the form designer like you normally would. And it will take care of, when you look at the control itself, the form, the pixels per inch is set there. And this is where I don't like them setting the default to be 150 dots per inch, because when you compare that to 192, it's not as exact of a match. But by doing it as 192, then you get the double the scaling, and that gives you a better design surface. Now, the critique of this is the IDE is not scaling the grid marks in the line, so they look really faint because they're one dot. And even though it has a scale grid size to the DPI that's set, so they're spaced out right, but they're not darker. They should be 2 pixels by 2 pixels size to give it the same weight. And then the other thing that I didn't clarify and I wanted to, which has to do with why the fonts don't translate as well. And that is, if you go to your DPI, your display settings for your windows, the text that I'm using is scaled by a 450%. That's what it figures out to use. But if you go to the advanced scaling section, what I'm really running at is 200% display. So my normal size is 5100, but it's actually treating that as half that. It double the regular size. So because you have these two different ways of scaling, that's why we get font scalings are different than dimensional scalings for window size, button size, etc. So a little bit more info. Hope that helps somebody.
For sure. And on a really, really big screen like yours, would it make sense to not double it, but even go for 4 times as much, so that you can see the buttons and the grids better even? Would that help?
Right now, if I go back to here, and I'm not sure how you're seeing this because it's going to get scaled down, but on my physical machine, this is the high DPI version of that I'm running. So it's 55,000 by 3,000 estimated. But if I were to use a ruler to measure from the top and bottom to the window, it's double. It's the same physical size that I would normally run it at 96 DPI. So it is, these buttons are easy to manipulate now. It's the standard height that I'm expecting it. Now, what really is getting rendered is everything's double. So the button height looks correct physically. It's about 3/8 of an inch tall by about an inch wide. The height is double. It's 50 instead of the normal 25. The width is 150 instead of the normal 75. The nice thing with that is by having 192 DPI, when I go and run this on a smaller 96 DPI machine, it just divides those things in half and I get the fidelity that I'm expecting.
So when you run that, say you're the developer who's on the 96 DPI machine, and your team is standardized on the 192 DPI, like you've said there. You check it out of version control, you work on it at 96 DPI. Is it going to change the form, the dimensions in the form?
Yeah, so what happens is, because whatever, so I load this up from source control and I move this button around. and I'm running on a 192 DPI setting in my IDE, when I go and save this change, that value gets recorded in the DFM file for it. So vice versa, if I'm a 96 developer, 96 DPI setting, that's why you don't want to have different ones, because you're going to fight version control.
So as long as you've got the same
one.
As long as you've got the same IDE setting for that, you set it on custom and you had 192. As long as everyone's got that, you won't have version control wars changing your.
Correct.
Yep.
So
and
that's why you would want to have them to be the same.
Yeah, and 192 you think is the sweet spot.
Well, it depends on what monitors people are running.
Yeah.
You know, again, if you don't have high DPI displays, then it's easy. Everybody runs at the standard display size. You don't have high DPI running in the IDE. Everything is stored as 96 as the default. It doesn't get stored. There's no version control issues. If you have one developer that's running it, you know, a high DPI display, you probably want him to be designing the forms at a low DPI, or at least doing something to fix it before checking it in, so that when the other developers get it, they're not seeing a change in the source file, which is fraught with problems.
Yeah.
So I would have that developer set their IDE to be 96 to match what the other developers are using. But then on the same side, if you have multiple developers all doing high DPI, set it to a consistent value so you guys can all support it, get nice design surface. The one developer that's running it low, he could set his to be 192 as well. When he loads it up onto a 96 DPI display, it's just going to be big. It would still be usable, but it'll be, you know, a different scale thing. So if you can get them all to be the same, that's what you want to do.
Thanks for the additional information.
You're welcome.
Does the way FMX deals with canvas and stuff sidestep any of these problems?
Well, not the same problems. The FMX can have some of its own things, but by its very nature, FMX does support scaling way better than the VCL does. And part of that's because of the rendering engine in FMX is different. Even though ultimately it renders down onto the canvas and the GDI plus base or DirectX or whatever, you know, depending on how you've got it set up and what it does. But the typical scaling and things that you use, you don't run into the same kind of problems. However, depending on the VCL or the FMX style that you use for the control surface, you can run into the same kind of problems with if you're doing a custom style and you're taking care of rendering the control elements. If you're, again, this is kind of tied to Windows itself, because the image slicing is still an issue there with the bordering that I talked about. But if you're doing things like edits on Mac OS or iOS or even Android, because most of those basic controls by default now go to the OS version, they render fine. And because the OS already takes care of the higher DPI values for your handheld devices and your tablets and your phones and so forth. So it's not really a problem on those sides. Still can be some issues depending on what you're doing on Windows. All right. Well, with that, I do have to bid farewell. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the conference and take care.
Hi guys, greetings to all. For anybody out there that doesn't know me, Lachlan and I are the continuity group. I began reselling Delphi in 2003. And in 2013, I became aware of developers and organizations with a need to support their Delphi projects in the short and long term, but they had difficulty finding the available expertise to provide that required support. So in 2013, I established the continuity group to provide that support. Our greatest challenge has always been to match customer needs with available developers that within the customer's time frame. So if you have a project that needs some support, you can contact Lachlan or myself. Or if you have some time available and would be interested in joining our team, please contact Lachlan or myself. Lachlan, would you like to add anything to that?
No, just that sort of, I guess, guys, if you've just got some capacity, it doesn't need to be full capacity and so on, but maybe you're working 3 days a week and you've got two days available. People who we're working with, a lot of them have their own projects as well. So it's an opportunity to pick up some work, but without sort of being fully responsible for a whole major project. Yeah, a lot of the people we work with, the developers we're working with are solo developers, and they're actually sort of quite enjoying working as part of a team. So that's an opportunity there to work with others as well. So yeah, if you've got some spare time, or if you've got a project that you're not sure what's going to happen in the future with it, get in touch with us and we'll do our best to help you. But other than that, I guess, enjoy your lunch.
Yeah, I'll just pipe in and say that, yeah, if you don't have some sort of, I suppose, continuity for if you, you know, get hit by a bus or something like that, you're doing your users a disservice. You need to have some mechanism whereby someone can take over your project and what have you.
We prefer the win the lottery option to get hit by a bus.
Yeah, indeed. Well, you mean if you win the lottery, you can, you know, hand the project over to someone, but if you get hit by a bus, you need to have that set up in advance, which you should definitely have that process in place. So yeah, so definitely, yeah, if you've got if you're a lone developer working on a project, you definitely need to talk to the T-continuity group.
Yeah, and
actually, in my new book, I mentioned you briefly as a, you know, how you know, you really every project. You know, I talk about the bus number, which is the minimum number of people who you can get hit by a bus and your project can continue. And if it's one, then you need, you know, another some sort of external party to be able to maintain your application.
Yeah, and also like it doesn't. We're not necessarily talking about necessarily taking over your source code from day one or anything like that. We've got a process where we can basically, it's about cracking open your head, extracting the knowledge and getting it in a format where someone else, maybe us, maybe someone else completely can come along and pick up the project. And that's our Knowledge Arc product, which is sort of a series of basically interviews over Zoom or something similar, which we record, categorize and build up an archive that someone else in the future can get a head start with your project if they needed to.
Just to confirm, you know, back up what Alistair said, I am just doing a quote at the moment, and it's into a hospital, and I'm up against the big medical companies. And the number one concern is what happens to me. And so as part of that quoting process is me saying, wait a minute, I've got this process in place. And then the other critical bit from my point of view is I want to sell my business in 3 years' time. I don't want the future buyer saying, wait a minute, we can't buy this company because you're the only developer. So from those two reasons alone, what happens to my customers helps me win contracts, but it also then helps me having a company that I can sell. They're two great reasons to be talking to the continuity group.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Alistair. Thanks, Shane. And I guess we'll let everyone have their lunch now and have a chat about other things on Zoom.